So I am sitting with Rav Cardozo. It is a Tuesday morning / afternoon, and Rav Cardozo just put on some music. Who did you put on?
I put on the cello concerto of Haydn.
And what I want to do with you is I want to quote a passage from Franz Rosenzweig that you kind of hinted to in a previous conversation. And then I want to hear you respond to it, and I actually think it has a lot to do with the music that you are listening to. So this is the quote. For those who don't know, Franz Rosenzweig was a German philosopher, Jewish, who in many ways was on the brink of converting to Christianity. He writes about it in his letters. It's not a guess. He says it, and he had this epiphany, this almost paradigm shift one Yom Kippur, and he went to the synagogue, and his whole life changed. And his writings are remarkable. I know they've influenced you a lot, Rav Cardozo. They've definitely influenced me. Okay, so this is a quote of Franz Rosenzweig after the Epiphany has happened. All of us to whom Judaism, to whom being a Jew has again become the pivot of our lives, and I know that in saying this here, I am not speaking for myself alone. We all know that in being Jews, we must not give up anything, not renounce anything, but lead everything back to Judaism, from the periphery back to the center, from the outside in. Your thoughts, Rav Cardozo?
Well, it relates to what we spoke about before, really, and that is that we can use any kind of wisdom and bring it back to and within the Jewish tradition. I don't know exactly how Franz Rosenzweig meant this. One has to look into the larger concept in which he writes this line, but it's a very famous line of his.
It was in one of the opening addresses to his Center of Jewish Learning.
Oh, right, with Martin Buber at the time. Yes, it is. Rosenzweig was a very original thinker. The interesting thing about it is that he was definitely not a Talmid Chacham. He didn't have the Talmudic background or anything like that. By the way, Martin Buber also did not have. Heschel helped Martin Buber a little bit. I don't know if anybody helped Rosenzweig, but he got it. That's the interesting thing about it. And one of the remarkable things about Rosenzweig also is that he sees a function for Christianity. He says that the Jewish values had to be somehow adopted by the Christian world to make them universal. We could, as Jews, being so small and in such a difficult position, not do that on our own. And therefore he sees that in Christianity there is a divine element there which need to be spread via Christianity, whatever it is, Protestant, Catholic, or whatever it is. And I think that this relates to this statement you just read, that he feels that therefore there are nearly no limits to the Jewish tradition, and we can also develop it in many different ways. Interesting, I lately have a discussion with somebody on the email who attacks me for the fact that I have been reading the Jewish tradition the wrong way. And I'm trying to convince him, but I don't think I'm very successful, to show him that I am not saying that my philosophy about the Jewish tradition is the only one, but it is definitely one of them. And one of them, which I believe is outside the Jewish tradition, is when we start to make it to be so much depending on sources which are not properly understood or are, I don't want to use the word outdated, but do not apply anymore today to our new conditions under which we live. I think that Rosenzweig had all these things in mind. He was a dreamer. He was somebody who saw a future, and therefore he became remarkably influential. Also his books, especially The Star of Redemption, is a very difficult book to read. Very difficult book to read. He wrote that part by part, I think, when he was in the army, and it is hard. It's hard stuff to read. I don't understand everything what he writes. This line, I think, is a great line, whatever he may have meant by it.
The reason I wanted to quote it to you, Rav Cardozo, because I think it reminds me a lot about your project and your life story. You know, you wrote a small autobiography, Lonely But Not Alone.
Correct.
And you know, you're proud about that you came from the outside in, that you're not apologizing for it. And in many ways, Spinoza, classical music, everything, Amsterdam, everything that you ever lived before you came to the Jewish world is a part of your Jewish thinking. And when Rosenzweig says, all of us, in other words, Baalei Teshuva, people coming from the outside in, there is this tendency to renounce, to try and feel, embarrassed about our non-Jewish culture that we came from. And Franz Rosenzweig is saying, no, we have to be a Baal Teshuva. We have to come back to Judaism in a more mature way. There's a reason why we were there in that world, and Correct. It is not random if you believe that Hashem is behind your life. So you have to bring that. So I want to ask you about, in terms of the Baal Teshuva movement. I know you were very involved in the early years in Or Sameach and outreach in Kirov. Do you feel like a lot of Baalei Teshuva, people who were secular, who became religious, do denounce their past and just as if they created a new version of themselves and they don't want to talk about the past? Do you think there's an immature Baal Teshuva and a mature Baal Teshuva? What do you think?
Yes, there definitely is. I've seen this from very close by with many of my students. This also became one of the reasons why I left Or Sameach, because I couldn't agree with the approach which was taken. And the approach was clearly, with some exceptions, but in general it was like, forget about your past, start all over again, be reborn, to use a non-Jewish expression, and start doing it the right way. Number one, it doesn't work because nobody can get out of his own skin. What you carry with you carry with you, whether or not you deny it and you want to ignore it, it won't work. And what we are seeing now is that with some of my students, they have great trouble with their children to keep them in the Jewish tradition, because they overwhelm them with this very narrow reading of the Jewish tradition, and the kids have no space. And therefore they feel no longer comfortable, and they have been walking out, and this happens frequently at the moment, which is a tremendous pity. One of the things which I did with my kids right, and I did lots of things wrong, is that I always said to them, I hope you stay religious, and they are, by the way, but you can go your own way. I'm not going to tell you what you should think. I sent my children to Haredi schools, which on one side I'm pleased with, on the other side I regret it, but at the time there was no other option. They learned a lot of nonsense and they learned a lot of good things, and at least gave them a good basis in Jewish learning, which is important. And I think it also gave them, which is one of the great things which I love about the Haredi community, the passion for the Jewish tradition, which you only find there, or at least more there than anywhere else. And that is very good, and that is something which I greatly admire within the Haredi community. But in general, it is true that most Baalei Teshuva stay immature, which is not their fault. It is the fault of the system in which they were brought and put into a miscarriage. They all had to fit into what already existed. In other words, there's an ultra-Orthodox community, or even a Dati Leumi community, modern Orthodox community. You now need to fit in there. This is one of the biggest mistakes the Baal Teshuva movement made, because they should have said, no, you can add something, you can contribute to the Orthodox world in your own way, and perhaps you can broaden it for us, and you can even show new aspects. And these people never got a chance to do that because they were cut short on all sides. I remember that I had students while I was still teaching in Or Sameach, and with all respect to the people in Or Sameach, where students came to complain to me about this. They said, I can't even say my own thing anymore. I can't even, think anymore and express that because they won't allow me to do that. I remember that in one or two cases I quoted Heschel in one of my shiurim while I was in Or Sameach, and even a Reform rabbi at the time, which I thought made a very good point, and I always quote people by name. And they were very annoyed with me for doing that, and I found that extremely, and I still feel like that, extremely small-minded.
I think this is something so profound about Franz Rosenzweig, and it's very connected to your Torah, your writings, is you don't renounce anything of the world you came from. And in that way, I would call you, if we don't want to, not judgmental language, but you're definitely about tshuva. You have a ger, a convert that is mature, that brings their entire world to the Jewish tradition, and it's very rare. This is something I've thought about a lot, that most people who do tshuva, who become religious from a secular background, they become Haredi. They don't become modern Orthodox or religious Zionists because they want something intense, which is on the one hand powerful, like we talked about, but something very unhealthy about that because there's so much they have to bring the Jewish tradition. And it's chaval, we lose out on the treasures of all these people from the outside when they almost delete their personality. So I want to ask you, how did you replicate, how did you embody this Franz Rosenzweig idea of bringing the periphery back to the center, the outside in, despite having so many influences around you which were probably saying, reject your past, ignore who you were?
I think there are two things here. First of all, I was brought up in a Dutch environment, which is a very liberal environment. Not for nothing did the Jews in the 17th century come to Amsterdam, because they were one of the very few places where they could live a Jewish life, and the government allowed them to do that. That was totally unheard of in the 17th century nearly anywhere else. Most Jews were completely rejected and ignored, and they were not allowed to live a religious life. The Dutch at the time were liberal thinkers. That's, by the way, why Spinoza could publish his stuff in Holland, and where many outsiders also published their stuff in Holland, because there was nowhere else to go. No other Medina, any other country would allow this heresy to be published. In Holland it was. I went to a non-Jewish school, very liberal, excellent school, who gave me that background. And I still benefit from that. It was very, very secular, but it was also very open-minded, and this became part of my personality without any doubt, and I'm still very pleased that I went through that kind of schooling, which was also excellent because we had Latin and we had Greek and we had a lot of other classical studies which really helped there. Not that at that time I agreed with that, but that later on I realized how much I benefited from that. And that's one of the great things about the Dutch. It has another side to it as well. They allow also certain things which they should not perhaps allow, but that goes always hand in hand. I think that is one thing. And the other thing which influenced me is perhaps the fact that I have a tremendous longing, I don't know from where it comes, for knowledge, for searching, for looking into books which I have not heard about, but when I see the text or I see the title, I say, I need to read that book. And then suddenly some things come about which I had not expected at all. I said, wow, this is great stuff, and I need to know more about it. And that happens all the time to me.
Was there a time period when you were in Gateshead where you felt embarrassed about your background? In other words, did this self-confidence about your background and being able to bring that into Torah always exist, or did it develop later? Did the Gateshead world crush it at the beginning?
No, it didn't crush it. That was a very interesting thing, which later in life I only realized that they didn't do that. They were very good teachers in that respect. Also, they were Haredi, but the word Haredi didn't exist in these days, but they definitely belonged to what we call today the Haredi world. The teachers were marvelous teachers. They were big tzaddikim. All the 8 years that I was in Gateshead, I never heard about any kind of strife between the different Roshei Yeshivot. There was a tremendous ruach spirit there. There was tremendous respect for the rabbis. the concept of what today is called Das Teure. That Torah didn't even exist. The rabbis were there to advise you, but if it was not halachic, you had to make up your own mind, but they would help you. And I had some very great teachers there who, perhaps today I wouldn't agree with their hashkafot, but there was something very broad-minded about this world, which at the same time was very isolated from the rest of the Jewish world. Very interesting, when you walked, and not so long ago I wrote about this, when you walked into Gateshead Yeshiva, time disappeared. It could have been the 17th century, it could have been the 2nd century, because you walk into the yeshiva, you walk into the Beit HaMidrash, there's a whole different world there, which is not bound by time. Like the Gemara is not bound by time, because all the rabbis, the hundreds of rabbis who lived in totally different periods of time, they are in discussion. That's the way how the Talmud was put together, which is a genius thing to do. Rabbis who didn't know about each other suddenly have a conversation.
So you're saying
the redactors did that, and that is still within the yeshiva world till today. The only thing today is that the yeshiva world, as I know it no longer has this broadness. I never felt anywhere discriminated against in the yeshiva. At that time, they went out of their way to help me. In the beginning, they didn't want to accept me because I didn't have enough knowledge, and they were right about it. And the rabbis in Amsterdam kept on pushing till they allowed me in, and they had to make -1, the first class, one below the 0-1, to let me in. And they gave me some nice teachers, and they were extremely nice to me. And I have learned tremendously from them. Even so today, my world is no longer the same world as their world.
Perhaps that early on intensity that you got from Gateshead, and yet also paradoxically open-mindedness, that set the platform for how you were going to be religious, that you were not going to renounce, you were not going to abandon your past self. Now, I just want to ask you, just to finish this conversation, do you have any advice for people who are, let's say somebody's listening who wasn't born religious and has become more and more invested in the Jewish tradition? Maybe they did it 20 years ago, maybe they did it last year, maybe they're doing it now. Do you have any advice for them how to go deeply into the Jewish tradition and yet still retain that sense of who they were before they came?
I would say that indeed never to reject anything of your past. First of all, be realistic. It won't work. It is not successful. Nobody ever managed anything like that. And it would be very unhealthy. From a religious perspective, I would say, if you are born within that framework, then there was a meaning to it, a purpose to it. I'm born from a mixed marriage, which by Jewish law is absolutely forbidden, right? And I still believe that this mixed marriage was min hashamayim, was from heaven. Right? That's, by the way, also a reason why sometimes I say to people who are in a mixed marriage and they are struggling with it, that there may be a meaning to this and God wants this to happen. Even so, this is not the official halacha, and I'm totally against mixed marriages. But there are exceptions, and these exceptions sometimes have produced people, whether it is myself or also much greater people than myself, which perhaps because of this mixture we were able to contribute something which others could not contribute to. So I'm actually very proud that I'm married and that I'm born from a mixed marriage. And my parents were very great people who were very much in love with each other. And my mother was very Jewish, but she, by the way, converted later in her life as well, as you know. But the same as with my brother, who is not Jewish halachically, but he is so Jewish, and we also respect.
I think what you said is so important to think about, that if you were born secular, if you were born non-Jewish and you convert, it was meant to be like that. In other words, take God seriously. That's divine providence. So to reject that is a type of atheism.
Yeah, it is rejecting something which it seems God after all wanted. Why? I do not know. But I would say only one thing, and that I often say to myself when I look in the mirror, I'm here with a specific purpose. There is a mission for me here which I have to realize under all conditions, which is the product of a mixed marriage. And therefore I am not going to deny that under any circumstances. And I think that is what I need to do, that is a mitzvah to do that, and I have to do this for the rest of my life, because that's who I am, and others are different. If you ask me, am I in favor of this, of mixed marriage? The answer is no. But when it happens, there's purpose to it.